Good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us for what we hope is again in our study of the story of the Bible. And just as the name implies, we're trying to see the entire story of the Bible from, as the old preachers used to say, from Genesis to the maps, all the way through, and to see that it's not just a collection of stories. And good moral stories with good endings and good characters, but it's all one theme running from beginning to end. And in that attempt, we have borrowed the 17 Bible time periods. You may or may not be familiar with that way of breaking down Bible history, but it was familiar enough that Jonathan and I thought we would use that as kind of the framework for our study. And each class, we're just taking one of those 17 Bible time periods and looking at it together. And we're thankful that you've joined us. My name again is Ken Chapman. I'm an evangelist at the South Bumby Church of Christ in Orlando, Florida. And our co-host, as always, is Jonathan Caldwell, who's an evangelist up at Moody, Alabama. Jonathan, how's it going tonight?
Doing well, enjoying our study. I'm hoping that this will be beneficial to those who see it, and maybe to those who are kind of new to Bible study, maybe new to the Lord, as far as providing some grounding, some foundation. And so I'm happy to be a part of the study and hoping that it bears some good fruit.
Yeah, in some sense, this is an introductory study, but it's also a study maybe for people who have been Bible students for some time to help you to see the Bible story as one continuous story. And maybe it's a good review. Maybe you've never studied it this way through these 17 Bible time periods. And one of the things we're challenging you to do is maybe put to memory these 17 Bible time periods, and here they are. And again, if you would like some material on this, maybe this chart in some kind of printable form, reach out to either Jonathan or myself, and we'd be glad to email you a copy of this, or you can just pause this and get pen and paper and write it down or screenshot it, however you want to do that. But try to put to memory these 17 Bible time periods. Tonight's study, we're going to look at period number 10, the divided kingdom. After the children of Israel have moved into the land and settled in their tribal territories, we have that dark period of Israel's history known as the Judges. And then God reluctantly gives in to their pleas and gives them a king, and we move into the period known as the United Kingdom, the reigns of Saul, David, and Solomon. And it's probably a hint, Jonathan, that we call it the United Kingdom, that maybe it's not going to stay united. Otherwise, we'd have just called it the kingdom. But here's the United Kingdom, and as we would have guessed, that it becomes the divided kingdom. And we're going to look at that period tonight. One of the maybe most difficult or neglected sections of Bible study. There's just a lot going on, a lot of kings, a lot of prophets. That makes this, in some sense, a more challenging study than just looking at the reign of one single king or the work of one single judge at a time, as we have done previously in our Bible study. If you think about it, up until this point, we just kind of talked about one person at a time. Abraham or Joseph or David or Solomon, but now seems like we're looking at multiple characters, prophets and kings here and kings there, and we're introduced to more kings of foreign nations as well. That makes this not an impossible study, but maybe a little bit more challenging study for us. Don't you think, Jonathan?
I think you're absolutely right. And some of this is because of the way it's written, as well as the writer of First and Second Kings goes back and forth. We'll deal with this king and then jump down to this king and move forward a king. Well, that requires us to go back up to Israel and then move forward there. And then they might move forward again, and then we jump down to Judah and do that again. And so it's written a little bit stranger than we're used to. And then also when you consider all of the prophets that at the end of the Old Testament, most of them are going to be scattered into the timeline of First and Second Kings. A lot going on here. And yeah, if we can just kind of get the overview of let's just go ahead and get it out of the way, of the downward trajectory of the nation and the kings at this time, then that will kind of help us place this in the overarching story of the Bible.
Yeah, as you indicate, kind of like the period of Judges, this is going to be a dark period and a decreasingly dark period in Israel's history, this period 10 of the divided kingdom. After the reign of Solomon, the kingdom now is going to be divided in two. And in our survey study, and that's what we're really doing in this series of studies, we're not going to be able to go through all of the kings, probably really none of the kings, but we're going to look at that period and just kind of what is going on in this period. And we'll just start with what are the reasons for the divisions. And Jonathan, I'm going to put you on the spot here. If you ask the average Bible student why the kingdom of Israel divided, what do you think the stated reason, we do read that in scripture, but what do you think the stated reason would be?
I would imagine the most common answer would be because of Rehoboam's folly, the foolishness he showed as the people come to him. Remember, Solomon was known for his building projects, and it was the people that was kind of holding those projects up, and it was wearing on them. So they come to Rehoboam and say, hey, please lighten our load. And then we all know the story where Rehoboam talks to the older advisors, and they say, you need to listen to your people and serve them and they'll serve you. And he listens to his young buddies, and they're like, no, show him who's boss. And so he tries to show him who's boss, and they all say, we're out of here.
Yeah, Rehoboam is the son of Solomon, and for about 2.5 days, he's the king of the United Kingdom. We don't normally think of him. We usually limit it to Saul, David, and Solomon, but he takes over the United Kingdom. His father, as you said, because of these building projects, had put burdens on the people, taxed them heavily. And to paraphrase, Rehoboam says, if you thought my dad could tax you, you ain't seen nothing yet, and makes that burden heavier. And now, because of that, some of the tribes break away and start their own kingdom. We have a unbloody, for the most part, civil war that takes place here. But that's not the only reasons that could be given, even stated in the scripture. There is certainly that stated reason of the actions, what we would say maybe the foolish actions of Rehoboam. But we need to remember also that when you study Israel's history up to the point, there was already a crack here. There's already a rift between the northern tribes and the southern tribes. You know, Jonathan, it makes me think of American history.
Right.
That before the war between the states, there was already a division of sorts between the North and the South. And even now, years after the war between the states, there's still a rift and a division kind of between the South and the North. And that was certainly the case in Israel's history. And so we kind of, this had, in some sense, it had been brewing for a while. It just took the final straw of Rehoboam's actions to bring it to its ultimate head, so to speak.
I don't want to jump ahead of you, and you can stop me. Are you going to discuss the spiritual reasons for why this is happening?
Yeah, and what I would argue is the real reason.
Right.
Those
exactly.
are the things that were kind of maybe providentially God used. Right. But in 1 Kings chapter 11, this is before Solomon even dies, before Rehoboam ever ascends to the throne, before Rehoboam ever seeks the advice of the older and the younger people, before he ever says, I'm going to increase the burden. God says this to Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 11. God says to Solomon, because you've done this, that is following after other gods, because you've done this and not kept my covenant or my statutes, which I've commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away the whole kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. And so don't get enamored with the actions of Rehoboam and say, that's why the kingdom divided. That was part of it. And again, maybe that's just the mechanism that God used. But God states, again, before Rehoboam ever made one decision as king, God says, I'm doing this. And I'm doing it because you have followed after other gods. And so that is the reason for the divided kingdom. Jonathan?
You see this kind of double background a number of times throughout Scripture. The Israelites going into Egypt and getting out of Egypt. There are spiritual reasons. There are God-given reasons for why that happens, and then there's some more physical, natural life reasons that these things happen. It's going to happen when Nebuchadnezzar comes in. The political reasons were the kings wouldn't be subservient to Nebuchadnezzar. But then God says, because you aren't faithful to me, I'm going to bring in Nebuchadnezzar. And so this is probably just a good place to go ahead and understand that a lot of times there are spiritual underlying divine reasons that God is bringing something about, but then he uses things in our world, politics, war, crime, whatever it may be, to enact those things. And we certainly see that here with Solomon / Rehoboam and the division of the kingdom.
Absolutely. And let's never forget, again, that is the reason. Good point, Jonathan. And so we have the reason or reasons for the division. Now let's talk about the results of the division. Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, retains the southern tribe of Judah, with Simeon kind of morphed into that one tribe. And so we have Judah in the south and Israel in the north. Now, it gets just a little bit confusing because we've spoken of Israel before, and meaning all 12 tribes and the entire tribal map. Now, when we speak of Israel from this point forward, we're going to talk about Israel as just being that northern part of the tribal map and just the northern tribes of Israel. And so we try to sometimes talk about the northern Israel or northern tribes of Israel to distinguish it from the entirety of Israel before this division.
And then you have the further moniker that's used, especially in the prophets, to talk about northern Israel of Ephraim, which was one of the northern tribes, one of the sons of Joseph, that becomes kind of that poetic name for the northern tribes. And so you really got to be focused, where we can't just assume who we're talking about when we use the term Israel anymore.
Yeah, and so we have to be careful, and as we always should, look at the context of what we're studying to see who or what's being talked about. And so now here's the results. Rather than one unified nation under one king, we now have two nations and two kings. And though they are still brethren, they're still serving the same God and should have the same purpose, and God is using them for the same purposes. They are now, to varying degrees and at different times, going to become kind of enemies of one another, at least antagonistic relationship. And so it's not going to be, again, that small rift that we saw is now going to be amplified. And so that's going to cause so many problems for really both nations. Now, Rehoboam is that first king in the south. And as God had prophesied to Jeroboam, the greater part of the kingdom would be torn away from him and given to someone else, and Jeroboam. And that's probably two of the kings that we have memorized from the divided kingdom is the first two, Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And so Jeroboam is the king in the north. And Jonathan, it's interesting that God speaks to Jeroboam as he has to kings of Israel in the past. And he makes a deal with Jeroboam. And that deal is, if you're faithful to me, and I'm certainly paraphrasing, but I hope I'm not doing any disservice to the text, that it basically says, I'll make you the next David.
Right.
I'll set you up a dynasty. David's going to have his dynasty in the south. I've promised that to David, but I will give you your dynasty in the north. If you're faithful to me, your name will be held in the same kind of lineage and dynasty form as David is in the south. And what a wonderful start, a wonderful promise to Jeroboam as he begins to keep as the king of the northern tribes of Israel.
Yeah, and he offers the same package basically that David got. And we're in the NFL off season, so we got free agents, and everybody's offering them different kinds of packages. The difference, though, and this is one thing to maybe keep in mind as we go forward, or as you study Scripture. So both of these offerings are covenants here. God's covenant with David, but what you see is in God's covenant with David, it is unconditional. Your son will sit on the throne. That's going to happen. Now he does say if he's faithless, I'll discipline him. But then to Jeroboam, God says, if you are faithful, I will keep your children on the throne. And so that would be an unconditional or a conditional covenant, excuse me. And so that's one thing you see throughout Scripture when it comes to covenants. Some of them are unconditional, some of them are conditional. And this is just another place that, we see the kind of offshoots of the story that keep on coming back into play throughout.
Yeah, that big little word, if.
Right.
If you are faithful. And as a Bible student, you recognize the rest of this story, that Jeroboam is not going to be faithful to God. Politics and religion usually don't blend very well, and they get in the way of Jeroboam. Jeroboam is fearful that if the inhabitants of his newly formed kingdom go down to Jerusalem to worship, as they were commanded by God to do, that they're going to feel some kind of allegiance for them and maybe end up just moving down there, and that would water down his kingdom. And so he thinks of a political tactic to be able to stop that. We'll just set up forms of worship here. And famously or infamously in Dan and Bethel, he sets up the golden calves. And as often is the case, he ends up doing exactly what he was trying to prevent. He drives the people away. In fact, you could argue that maybe most of the true worshipers of Jehovah just pack up and leave. And I think the actions of Jeroboam have a lasting effect in Israel, maybe far above than what we normally even think of, is just because he has taken so many faithful people and basically run them off by his actions. And so it's going to be no surprise that the actions of Israel, the northern tribes of Israel going forward, are not going to be driven by people who want to serve God. And so I find it also kind of ironic that God had promised a legacy, a dynasty for Jeroboam, and that's what Jeroboam gets. He gets a legacy. His name's going to be mentioned, not in the way that God had promised if he had been faithful, but throughout Israel's history, the name of Jeroboam, just like the name of David, is going to be brought up in Israel or Judah's history now in a favorable way. Jeroboam's name is going to be brought up, the sin of Jeroboam, the sin of Jeroboam. And so he gets a legacy, but it's not the legacy that God had promised him, and all because of that phrase, the sin of Jeroboam, in which he made Israel to sin in setting up those golden calves in Dan and Bethel. And so from now on, we just see as that's kind of this downward spiral. It's almost like a race to see who can be worse, and Israel in the north will win that race. Because as you maybe have studied, there'll be really no good kings in Israel. They will all follow to some degree, maybe even a worse degree, the sin of Jeroboam and following after other gods or not serving God the way he wants to be served. Judah in the south will have just enough good kings spattered in amongst their terrible kings to make their history last a little bit longer, but it's just a sad part in Israel's history. And so that brings us to our next point, and that is, what are some lessons from the division? We see really the result of division. division rarely makes things better or stronger. And so God has always wanted unity among his people. There's certainly many lessons. How many sermons, Jonathan, have been preached from Jeroboam and about worship and the integrity of worship in our relationship to God from Jeroboam's sin, from the divided kingdom of serving after other gods and doing those things. And there's so many lessons from this period of Israel's dark period of Israel's history. And maybe one that we want to look at is just the importance of being unified as God's people, of staying on the same page and serving with one heart and one spirit in one direction of serving God. And then we have, to kind of close it out, the legacy of the division. And again, Jeroboam has his legacy in the north. The legacy in the south is really still just attached to David and of that promise that God had made to David. And it's largely based upon the faithfulness and the heart of David. But we also can't discount the fact that God is, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but God is using these people. They are the vehicle through which he's going to bring about the promises to Abraham, particularly the promise of the Messiah, that in thy seed, all nations of the earth would be blessed. And so God is going to try to hang on to these people as long as his righteousness will allow, so that he can bring to fruition this great promise that still awaits to deal with the sin problem. And so the legacy of this division is just going to be, again, kind of almost this race. Jonathan, I think of the, what is it the Boy Scouts do sometimes with the soapbox derby, where they put these cars up on an incline and they let them go, and it's a race. That's kind of what we see Israel and Judah doing, is they're just kind of racing to the bottom. And of course, as we're going to see, Israel will get there before Judah. But maybe much of the legacy from this is the failure to learn lessons.
Right.
Over and over again. God, through prophets, through judgments, you should have seen, oh, wait, God's punishing them. We better straighten up. But sadly, that just doesn't happen enough.
Right. You make the point that Israel gets to the bottom first, in that they are carried away captive, by the Assyrians. But then in Ezekiel, God comes back and just goes after the people of Judah, because they're actually now worse than Israel, and furthermore didn't learn the lesson. You had two brothers, Ken. I had 4 siblings. I'm the baby. I was smart in that I watched them get in trouble and I didn't make the same mistakes. And that was what God was hoping for Judah, and that didn't happen. And so while, Israel may have gotten there first, in the end, Judah looks even worse because they didn't learn the lesson.
It's sad to admit I was more like Judah. I saw my parents discipline my brothers and said, yeah, I'll have some of that, and did not learn those lessons. But that's maybe the lessons, the legacy of this division is the failure to learn those lessons of God's judgment against him.
One more thing real quick is also maybe the lesson of learning not to rely on a human king. This is going to be their weakness from the time they ask for a king. They're always looking around at those nations around them. We want a king like them. Well, this is what happens when you have a king like them. You get failure, you get abuse, you get faithlessness to God. And if they had trusted in God all along, remember God told Samuel, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. And so finally, when we see the one true king come, we see what a king is supposed to look like. And we are now supposed to be the subjects that the Israelites and the people of Judah should have been.
You're right. So many times they wanted to rely upon either their king or maybe some king of a neighboring nation.
Right.
This nation's oppressing us. And so instead of turning to God, we'll turn to this other king from another nation. And again, it was just the failure to learn the lessons that God was trying to teach them. And so that's the legacy and maybe the primary lesson that we need to see from this period of Israel's history. Now, There's still more to go. We have to look at Judah alone and the captivity. You know, those periods are so tied together that it makes it kind of awkward to stop this study, but to stay faithful to our 17 Bible time periods. We'll end period number 10 right there. We thank you for joining us and hope that you'll continue with our study next Monday night at 6:30. Hope to see you then.